Welcome to the first tutorial for Afterthought Everything Socks. This is a tutorial that gives you information for how to knit socks that have an afterthought heel, afterthought toe, and afterthought cuff. This is especially handy if you need to be traveling and you would like to just knit a long tube for the foot and leg of the sock and add the details later. For this tutorial, I am going to use a crochet hook that is the same size as my knitting needle. So I'm using a C hook, which is 2.75 millimeters. I am using a US2 Chow red lace circular knitting needle that's 32 inches long in the US2 size, which is 2.75 millimeters. I have a ball of waste yarn for my provisional cast on, and I have a cake of sock yarn. This yarn in particular is from Sugar Plum Circus. Ideally, it's a good idea to have a waste yarn that is a different color from your main sock yarn so that you can see differentiation between the two. It will be very, very handy for you later. Trust me on that. So I am going to be showing you a crochet cast on. This is a very effective and simple way to do a provisional cast on. A provisional cast on means that this yarn will be removed at a later point in the project, so it doesn't matter if it matches, and as I said, it's actually better if it doesn't. We're going to start with a slip knot. I assume that if you are watching a technique tutorial for Afterthought Everything Socks, that you have at least a basic knowledge of knitting. Afterthought Everything Socks are not ideal for a first pair of socks, but if you're ambitious, you could go ahead. So you have the slip knot on the crochet hook. I am a continental knitter, so I'm going to have the yarn in my left hand. The yarn goes over the knitting needle. Okay, so knitting needle on top of yarn. The yarn goes over the needle and the hook pulls it through. Move your yarn to the back. Again, it goes over the needle and the hook pulls it through the loop. Oop. There we go. Wrap your yarn around to the back. Yarn goes over and through to the back. Over, through to the back. So you can see at this point I have cast on 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. I'm going to keep going until I have 64 stitches on this needle because that is how many stitches I use for a sock. I will be right back. So now I'm at the point that I have all 64 stitches on my needle that I need for my sock, but I still have this loop left on my crochet hook. So what I'm going to do is take my little scissors, snip, and without wrapping the yarn around the needle, wrap the yarn around again, pull through the loop, and then just keep pulling. So now you have a slip knot on this end and a little fasten off knot on this end. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually start knitting the sock. If you wanted to, or if it mattered how long the length was, you could knit a couple rows or a couple rounds of this. I prefer to just jump right into the sock knitting. So I'm going to pull my working yarn out of the cake. And the way I join yarns in is actually very, very simple. I don't knot them or anything else. I literally just hold them together and start knitting. The first couple stitches may feel a little bit loose, and that's okay because you will be able to come back and tighten them later. There we go. and I'm just going to knit like I'm knitting any other normal knitted project. See? So the first stitches are a couple loose, but that's fine. I can just give it a little tug. Totally fine. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to knit across half of my stitches. So I've knitted half my stitches now. I've got half my stitches on this needle, half my stitches on that needle. To set up for knitting these socks, magic loop, I'm going to take the needle with the working yarn, just going to hold them together and pull it through halfway. So I've got a loop on this side and a loop of the cable on that side. I have my little bunny ears. And then I'll keep knitting. Once you've knit the last stitch of the row, you now need to join them to begin working in the round. And always you see in patterns, make sure you don't twist your cast on when you join, right? Because you would end up with a very, very twisty sock. So you've got all these tails and you've got all these stitches. How can you make sure that you're not twisting your cast on? Right now, get this purple line, the provisional cast on, and make sure it's twisted all to the bottom. Okay, see here? That's twisted. Make sure it's all to the bottom, like that. So that when you turn, and this is part of why it's helpful to have a contrasting color for your provisional cast on, when you turn, you should see all your contrast color on the bottom. And I do this before I pull the needles out for magic loop, because I find that the structure of the needles makes it easier for me to get my stitches all lined up nice and smoothly. So now I'm going to pull out my back needle, swing it around to the front, and start knitting again. Remember that this is your loose stitch, so you may need to tug on that tail, and that'll get secured away later as you're done knitting. And now you are ready to just keep knitting around and around and around and make some super duper cool socks.
Once you've knit the tube of your sock and your cuffs as well, you're going to take some scissors and a tapestry needle threaded with waste yarn. We're going to separate this tube into two separate tubes. So to start off with, you can see I have cuffs on both ends of the tube, and I'm just folding it in half, right? Cuffs lined up, good to go, because you want socks that are the same length. And at about halfway through, you're going to take the tapestry needle and you're going to insert it into the right leg of a stitch. Any stitch, doesn't really matter. And you're going to start going through the right side of the V of each stitch around. You want to make extra sure that you are going into the stitch next to the one you just did. It might be a little bit hard to see, so I usually just stick my hand right inside the sock tube, and when you can spread the stitches a little, it makes it easier to see which stitches are next to each other. It also helps if you can look at the colors, if it's not a solid colored sock. Like you can see that there's the lighter blue above and the slightly darker blue below on this particular row of the sock. So it helps to be able to see that. Right now there's green above and blue below. So I can see that I'm just following these blue stitches right now. You're going to keep going around, picking up these stitches. Every few stitches, I end up just pushing the tapestry needle through, just so they don't fall off the needle. And of course, just pulling the waste yarn through. If you have ever put in a lifeline into your knitting, that's exactly what we're doing. We're basically going to be putting in 2 lifelines in this sock, and then removing the row that is between them. So I'm going to finish the rest of the way around, put the rest of this lifeline in, and meet you back at the beginning of the row. Now I'm right back at where the first stitch was picked up, and if you notice, I am now one row above because knitting works in a spiral. So if you do this correctly, the last stitch you pick up should actually look like it's one row above the first stitch. Okay? So stretch your yarn out a little bit, and I'm just going to snip and tie a little bit of a bow or a knot or whatever. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You're just trying to secure this while you put in the second lifeline. So just simple little overhand knot and a bow. Because why not? Ta-da! Okay, now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a second lifeline in, and we're going to do it one row above the first lifeline that was put in. If you're concerned about losing stitches, you can put it in 2 rows above. So 2 rows above would be that blue, like this. If you wanted to go through, you can see that there would be 2 rows of stitches in between this lifeline and the other one. Right? So there you can see that's 2 visible rows. And this is if you're concerned about dropping stitches when you divide the socks in half. For me, I'm going to put it in 1 row above just because that's what I do. Start at the same stitch. See this yellow right here? You've got 1 row of a gap between these stitches. And it is much easier to put in the second lifeline than it is to put in the first one, because all you have to do is watch for that gap in the row of stitches. See, now you can easily see where the next stitch should go because you're going to consistently have that 1 row in between lifelines. And that way, if you get confused or you're not sure which stitch is next, or you've just rotated your project or whatever, all you want to do is make sure that you are maintaining that 1 row gap in between your lifelines. I'm going to go put the rest of the lifeline in, and I'll meet you back at the beginning of the row. So here I am again. The second lifeline is just about complete. You can see that I'm back. You can see that it looks like I'm 1 row above because of that spiraling effect that we mentioned before. And once again, I'm just going to tie off my ends to secure these lifelines. If you have never put in a lifeline before, a lifeline means that these are going to be holding your live stitches once the sock tubes are separated, okay? So you want to make sure that you're not just leaving the ends dangling free, but you also don't need to be real fussy about how you secure them. So now you can see that there's 1 row in between. Pick any stitch in the middle, pick up 1 leg of it. I like to give it a good yank, make it really, really, really tall. And then the fun part, grab your scissors and snip. Ta-da! Not so scary, right? You only have to snip that 1 stitch when you're doing this type of heel and toe. So now what you're going to do is you're going to put your hand back into the tube and just use either the tip of a knitting needle. I'm going to use my tapestry needle, and you're going to start unraveling this row of knitting. You want to be careful because of the spiraling effect that if you have 1 row of knitting in between your lifelines, that you only unravel to the beginning of the round. And you'll see at the end of this video what I mean, because I actually made a mistake at the end of this video, and I will show you how to fix it. So right now, just start unraveling that row that is in between your 2 lifelines. And you can see that on the lifelines now, you've got live stitches. And they're all going to be nicely aligned and ready to work when you're ready to work your sock again. That's why I made sure that you pick up the right leg of the stitch. So we're going to just keep going around, and you're going to do this every single stitch, just pulling out the row in between. I'll speed it up a little bit so you don't have to watch me pick out every single stitch individually. So as you can see, I'm just going around the sock, pulling out every stitch as I go. And when the thread gets a little bit too long, I do take the scissors and trim it. You want to make sure you don't cut all of it off because then you'd have to weave in those ends. But for right now, it's fine. This is especially why I like having my hand inside the sock as I go around, because I can keep a little bit of that tension on the lifeline and help myself pick it out more easily. Now, I'm starting to approach the spot where I made the mistake that would be very easy to make. As I'm coming up to the beginning of the round, it didn't really occur to me that you need to, account for the spiraling of the knitting. So I over picked out stitches and I actually ended up pulling out one of the live stitches. Okay? So watch what I do right here. I go, oh shoot, I just picked out one of the live stitches on the bottom. Right there, I'm tugging on it. So I'm just going to hold it and I'm going to finish picking out from the other direction because that was the last stitch of the row and I accidentally picked out the last stitch of the row. And when I say last stitch of the row, you're like, Ruth, you're working in spirals. Yes, we are working in spirals, but for our purposes right now, the row begins where you first started inserting the lifeline, which is why it's important for you to insert your lifeline starting directly above or below that first lifeline. So we're coming to the magical moment, the last stitch to pick, and ta-da! They are separated. Check that out. So you now have two completely separated tubes for socks. Look at that. They're the same. The cuffs are the same length and everything. So now I'm going to show you how I will fix this little mistake that I made picking out that one last live stitch. Just going to thread my needle. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the path that a stitch would take. Okay? So this is why it's important to be able to look at your knitting and understand where the yarn is going. All the other stitches are wrapped around the lifeline. So I am going to wrap my yarn around the lifeline, bring it back to the front, because that's what all the other normal stitches do. See, anchored on, and I'm going to just insert the needle tip down into that stitch. Ta-da! My live stitch is now back on the lifeline and I will be good to go to knit my toes.